There existed, in the southwestern corner of Ohio, a county whose prosperity was written not in monuments, but in the silent accumulation of harvests, the patient turning of millstones, and the modest ink entries of surveyors who parceled the wilderness into measured plots, the men and women who cleared its forests, who stood knee-deep in the Ohio's brown current loading barrels, who baptized their children in creeks now channeled and forgotten. These souls left behind no grand declarations. Yet their labor shaped the very contours of settlement, and their names, recorded in fading ledgers and cemetery stones tilted by frost, whisper still of a world both industrious and intimate. What became of the ordinary day in Hamilton County? What filled the hours between dawn and dusk when the nation was young and the land still bore the marks of ancient forests? Welcome to the American Gazetteer. Tonight, we turn the pages of history back to Hamilton County, Ohio, as it existed throughout that long century when the Republic itself was learning to walk. We shall move slowly through its townships and along its waterways, pausing to observe the texture of its fields, the character of its inhabitants, and the rhythm of a life now vanished entirely from the American landscape. The Ohio River formed the county's southern boundary, a great artery of commerce and passage that connected the settled East to the territories beyond. Its waters, broad and often turbid, carried flatboats laden with flour, whiskey, pork, and the hopes of families moving westward. Along its banks, settlements took root where the terrain allowed, where a natural landing offered purchase for a boat, or where a creek emptied into the main current and provided fresh water for livestock and mills. The river was not merely a line upon a map. It was a presence, a force that rose with spring rains and shrank in summer drought, that froze in bitter winters and thawed with unpredictable violence. Families living within sight of its waters organized their lives around its moods. They knew which months brought the best conditions for shipping, when the channel ran deep enough for loaded vessels, and when sandbars emerged to strand the unwary. The first European-descended inhabitants arrived in the closing years of the 18th century, finding a landscape thickly forested with oak, hickory, beech, and walnut. The work of clearing began immediately, an effort measured not in days but in years, as axes rang against hardwood and fires consumed the brush. Families such as the Ludlows, the Sims, and the Ferris households established claims and began the slow transformation of wilderness into arable land. Settlement concentrated initially near the river and along Mill Creek, a tributary that flowed southward through the county's interior. Mill Creek offered water power, and within a few decades of initial habitation, its banks hosted grist mills, sawmills, and small manufactories. The creek's name, simple and descriptive, reflected the utilitarian relationship these early settlers maintained with the land. The soil varied considerably. In the bottomlands near the rivers, alluvial deposits provided rich, dark earth well suited to corn and wheat. These fields, once cleared, yielded abundantly, and farmers learned to anticipate the seasonal floods that both enriched and threatened their crops. On the uplands, the soil tended toward clay and required more labor to prepare, though it proved adequate for general husbandry and the cultivation of orchards. The township system imposed order upon the wilderness. Surveyors divided the county into regular units, each containing 36 sections of 1 square mile. This grid, overlaid upon creek beds and ridge lines, created a geometry of ownership and responsibility. Roads followed section lines where feasible, producing the characteristic right angles still visible in rural landscapes. Farmers referred to their holdings by section number and township name, a language of location that became second nature. Within this framework, communities coalesced. A crossroads might acquire a blacksmith's shop, then a general store, then a meeting house. These nuclei of settlement bore names both aspirational and plainly descriptive, names drawn from the old country, from local landowners, from biblical passages, or simply from the topography itself. Each hamlet developed its own character, shaped by the particular mix of families who settled there and the industries that proved viable. The work of early settlement was relentless. Stumps remained in fields for years, their roots slowly decaying until they could be extracted. Fences were built of split rails, laid in zigzag patterns that required no post holes but consumed vast quantities of timber. Livestock hogs primarily, but also cattle and sheep ranged semi-wild through the remaining woodlands, fattening en masse and requiring only seasonal roundups. This open-range system persisted until population density made it impractical, when the transition to fenced pasturage gradually took hold. Water defined much of daily existence. Wells were dug by hand, sometimes to considerable depth before reliable sources were struck. Springs were prized, and properties containing them commanded higher value. Creeks provided not only power for mills, but also water for livestock, washing, and in dry seasons, irrigation. The quality of water varied. Some sources ran clear and cold. Others carried the tang of minerals or the discoloration of clay. Winter brought a particular set of challenges. The Ohio sometimes froze solid enough to permit crossing on foot or by wagon, though this was never without risk. Snow transformed the landscape into a monochrome expanse, and travel became arduous. Families relied upon stores laid by during warmer months, barrels of flour, smoked hams, preserved vegetables, and firewood stacked high against the outer walls of cabins and houses. The rhythm of the year demanded foresight. The transformation from wilderness to farmland occurred unevenly. Some families prospered quickly, clearing large tracts and acquiring additional parcels. End quote. Others struggled against illness, poor soil, or simple ill fortune. The land kept its own counsel regarding who would succeed and who would abandon their claims. Yet the general trend was toward consolidation and improvement as the county's agricultural capacity grew year by year, and the marks of permanent settlement, roads, bridges, mills, churches accumulated like interest upon invested labor. At the heart of Hamilton County stood Cincinnati, a city that began as a collection of cabins near the mouth of the Licking River and grew, with remarkable rapidity, into a commercial center of regional importance. Its location positioned on the Ohio's north bank, with access to both river traffic and inland routes, conferred advantages that speculators and settlers alike recognized immediately. The settlement passed through several names in its infancy. Losantiville, an elaborate Latinate construction, gave way to Cincinnati, a name honoring the Society of the Cincinnati and imbued with classical Republican sentiment. This rechristening reflected the aspirations of its founders, who envisioned not merely a trading post, but a proper city, organized and enlightened. The city's growth was fueled by its role as a transshipment point. Goods arriving from the east by wagon or canal were transferred to rivercraft for the journey downriver to Louisville Street, Louis, and ultimately New Orleans. Conversely, products from the interior agricultural surpluses, timber, whiskey, moved through Cincinnati on their way to eastern markets. This exchange generated wealth, employment, and a constant hum of activity along the public landing. By mid-century, Cincinnati had acquired a diverse population. German immigrants arrived in substantial numbers, bringing skills in brewing, butchering, and various trades. Their neighborhoods developed distinct characters, with German-language newspapers, churches, and social organizations. The city's cultural life reflected this plurality, with singing societies, theatrical performances, and public lectures offered in multiple tongues. Pork packing became Cincinnati's signature industry, earning the city the informal designation Porkopolis. The process was efficient and comprehensive. Hogs were driven in from surrounding counties, slaughtered in large establishments along the Mill Creek bottoms, and rendered into ham, bacon, lard, and other products. The work was seasonal, concentrated in the cooler months when meat could be preserved without rapid spoilage. During packing season, the city's population swelled with laborers, and the air carried the unmistakable scent of rendering. The streets of Cincinnati were unpaved for many years, turning to mud in wet seasons and raising clouds of dust in dry ones. Wooden sidewalks provided pedestrians with some relief, though these frequently required repair. The city government, responding to petitions from merchants and residents, gradually undertook paving projects, beginning with the main commercial thoroughfares and expanding outward as funds permitted. Residential architecture evolved from log and frame construction toward brick, especially after fires demonstrated the vulnerability of wooden structures. Prosperous families built substantial townhouses in the Federal and Greek Revival styles, with tall windows, ornamental ironwork, and small front yards enclosed by iron fences. These homes, arranged along streets that climbed the hills surrounding the riverfront basin, signaled the city's transition from frontier outpost to established urban center. Education was a matter of civic pride. The city supported public schools, and several academies and colleges were founded by religious denominations and private associations. Families such as the Longworths, the Harrisons, and the Andersons endowed scholarships and funded building projects, linking their names to institutions that promised to elevate the intellectual life of the city. The city's relationship with the surrounding countryside was symbiotic. Farmers brought produce to market each week, their wagons lining the streets near the public square in the hours before dawn. Market days were social occasions as much as economic exchanges. News was traded along with vegetables, and connections were maintained between rural and urban kin. Churches multiplied as the population grew. Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Catholic, and Lutheran congregations each erected buildings, many of considerable architectural ambition. The spires of these churches punctuated the skyline, visible from the river and serving as navigational landmarks for boatmen. Sunday observance was widespread, and the Sabbath brought a notable quieting of the city's usual bustle. Cincinnati's newspapers, several competed vigorously provided residents with local news, editorials on national politics, and advertisements for the myriad goods and services available within the city. The papers also printed literary works, serialized novels, and reports from correspondents in other cities, connecting Cincinnati to the broader currents of American life. Families such as the Wrights and the Wilsons were prominent in the printing trades, their presses running day and night to meet the demand for information. The Ohio River remained central to the city's identity and economy. Steamboats, which became common by the 1820s, transformed river travel from a slow, arduous process dependent on current and oars to a relatively swift and predictable enterprise. The steamboat landing at Cincinnati became a scene of constant animation, with arrivals and departures announced by the deep whistle blasts that echoed off the surrounding hills. Passengers disembarked to continue their journeys overland, and freight was shifted with practiced efficiency by gangs of laborers. Hamilton County was divided into a dozen townships, each with its own character shaped by topography, soil, and the particular mix of families who claimed its sections. To speak of the county as a unified whole is to obscure the local distinctions that mattered greatly to those who lived within its boundaries. A farmer in Crosby Township might have more in common with a Kentucky neighbor across the river than with a resident of the northeastern townships, where the land rose into hills and the crops differed. Columbia Township situated along the river east of Cincinnati, contained some of the county's oldest settlements. The village of Columbia itself predated Cincinnati by a short margin and maintained a quiet dignity, its brick buildings and tree-lined streets reflecting the prosperity of long-established families. The Stites, the Denman, and the Vattier names appeared frequently in local records, their holdings spanning generations. Anderson Township, farther east still, was characterized by hilly terrain and smaller farms. The soil required more labor to work, but orchards thrived on the slopes, and the township became known for its apple and peach production. Families such as the Andersons themselves, the Mercers, and the Suttons cultivated these orchards with care, grafting varieties that proved suited to the local conditions and experimenting with techniques passed down from older regions. Mill Creek Township followed the watercourse that gave it its name, stretching northward from Cincinnati into the county's interior. The creek provided abundant water power, and mills of various types, grist, saw, woolen, paper, operated along its banks. Small industrial villages grew up around these mills, their populations tied to the rhythms of manufacturing rather than agriculture. The Schaefers, the Kempers, and the Walshme DT families were prominent among the mill operators, their enterprises supplying the surrounding countryside with essential goods. Sycamore Township, in the county's northeastern quadrant, remained more heavily forested than most. Its fields wrested from the timber with great effort. The soil was adequate but not rich, and farmers supplemented their income with logging, floating timber down the Little Miami River to market. The township's population was sparser, and its settlements smaller and more isolated. Names such as Compton, Kugler, and Naylor recurred in the township records, often linked to particular sections and roads. Green Township, west of Mill Creek, was predominantly agricultural, with large fields of corn and wheat dominating the landscape. The township's relative flatness made cultivation easier, and farmers here produced substantial surpluses for market. The social life of the township centered on churches and district schools, which also served as venues for elections and public meetings. The Greens, the Colerans, and the Wesselman families were among those who shaped the township's communal affairs. Coleraine Township, bordering Greene to the west, shared much of its agricultural character. The land here sloped gently toward the Great Miami River, which formed the county's western boundary. The river, though less commercially significant than the Ohio, still supported local trade and provided water power for mills. Families such as the Dunhams, the Beekmans, and the Pools established farms that remained in family hands through multiple generations, the land passing from father to son with each division and bequest. The southern townships Delhi, Crosby, and Whitewater hugged the Ohio River's course. These areas benefited from the richest bottomland soils, and enjoyed direct access to river transportation. Villages such as Delhi and North Bend served as shipping points for agricultural goods, and the sight of wagons converging on these landings was common throughout the growing season. The Harrison family, whose most famous member became president, held extensive lands in North Bend, and the Sims family likewise maintained significant holdings throughout the southern townships. Each township maintained its own roads, bridges, and public buildings through a system of tax assessment and labor contributions. Residents were expected to contribute a certain number of days' work annually to road maintenance, clearing ditches, repairing bridges, and grading surfaces. This communal labor reinforced social bonds and provided an opportunity for neighbors who might otherwise rarely meet to work side by side. The northeastern townships Sims, Sycamore, and Anderson were united by their shared topography of ridges and hollows. Travel between them could be arduous, especially in wet seasons when roads became nearly impassable. Yet these difficulties fostered self-reliance and a sense of distinctness from the more accessible parts of the county. Families in these townships tended to marry within their own communities, and local traditions persisted longer here than in areas more exposed to the currents of change flowing through Cincinnati. The agricultural year in Hamilton County followed a pattern as predictable as the passage of the sun. Each season brought its appointed tasks, and families organized their lives around this cycle. Deviation from the schedule, planting too early, or harvesting too late, invited failure, and farmers learned to read the signs of weather and soil with practiced attention. Spring began with the preparation of fields. Plowing commenced as soon as the ground thawed sufficiently to turn, often in late March or early April. Teams of horses or oxen pulled wooden plows, later replaced by iron chair versions that cut more cleanly through the earth. The smell of freshly turned soil filled the air, a scent earthy and full of promise. Behind the plow came the harrow, breaking clods and smoothing the surface for planting. Corn was the primary crop. Planted in hills rather than rows in earlier decades, the practice gradually shifted to row planting as farmers adopted cultivators that required regular spacing. Corn grew rapidly in the warm, humid summers, the stalks reaching heights of 8 or 10 feet by late July. The crop was versatile. Some was harvested green for immediate consumption, some left to mature for grinding into meal, and much was fed to livestock, particularly the hogs that formed a central part of the farm economy. Wheat occupied a significant but secondary place. Planted in autumn, it overwintered as green shoots, then resumed growth with the spring warmth. Harvest came in late June or early July, a period of intense labor. Men wielded cradles, scythes, fitted with wooden fingers that gathered the cut stalks, moving through the fields in rhythmic sweeps. Women and children followed, binding the sheaves and standing them in shocks to dry. The wheat was then hauled to barns for threshing, a process accomplished by flailing or, later in the century, by mechanical threshers powered by horses walking in circles or by steam engines. Gardens supplied vegetables for household consumption. Every farm maintained a plot near the kitchen door, planted with potatoes, beans, peas, squash, cabbage, and root vegetables such as turnips and carrots. Women and children bore responsibility for the garden's care, weeding and watering through the growing season, and harvesting as each crop matured. Surplus vegetables were preserved by drying, pickling, or storing in root cellars dug beneath a house or barn. Orchards provided fruit that varied the diet and could be processed into cider, preserves, and dried stores. Apples were ubiquitous, thriving in the county's climate and serving multiple purposes. Cider, both the fresh, sweet variety and the fermented, hard version, was consumed in quantities that might surprise modern observers. Pears, cherries, and peaches also grew well, though they required more careful tending and were more vulnerable to late frosts. Livestock demanded attention throughout the year. Cattle required pasture in warm months and hay in winter, along with access to water and salt. Milking was a twice-daily task, performed in the dim light of early morning and again at dusk. The milk was consumed fresh, churned into butter, or made into cheese. The techniques passed down through generations and varied according to family tradition. Hogs were perhaps the most important livestock. They thrived on corn, kitchen scraps, and the mast they gleaned from woodlots. Butchering occurred in late autumn when the weather turned cold enough to prevent spoilage. The process was communal, with neighbors assisting one another in turn. Every part of the animal found use. Hams and bacon were smoked, fat rendered into lard, intestines cleaned and used as sausage casings, and even the bristles saved for brushes. The work was bloody and exhausting, but it filled the smokehouse and ensured meat through the winter. Summer brought its own rhythm. Haying commenced in late June, cutting the grasses that grew in meadows and along fence rows. The hay was raked into windrows, then forked onto wagons and transported to the barn, where it was stored in the loft. A good hay crop meant well-fed livestock through the winter. A poor crop meant difficult decisions about which animals to keep and which to sell or slaughter. Autumn was a time of harvest and preparation. Corn was cut and shocked in the fields, then husked at leisure over the following weeks. Families often gathered for husking bees, social occasions where the work was accompanied by conversation, singing, and the prospect of discovering a rare red ear which entitled the finder to a kiss from the person of their choosing. The corn was stored in cribs, ventilated structures that allowed air circulation to prevent mold. Winter offered respite from field work, but not from labor. Firewood required cutting, splitting, and stacking, an ongoing task that kept families warm and provided employment for the long, dark months. Fences needed repair, tools required mending, and livestock still demanded feeding and watering. The shorter days and colder temperatures imposed a slower pace, and families spent more time indoors, by necessity and by choice. Within the farmhouse, labor was continuous and varied, organized according to gender and age. Women bore responsibility for the vast array of tasks that sustained the household: cooking, cleaning, washing, sewing, preserving food, tending the sick, and raising children. These duties were not incidental to the farm's operation, but essential, for without them, the farm could not function. Cooking was a skill acquired through apprenticeship, as daughters watched their mothers and gradually assumed responsibility for preparing meals. The fireplace served as the primary heat source in early years, with pots suspended on cranes and bread baked in Dutch ovens nestled in coals. Later in the century, cast iron stoves became common, offering more control over temperature and freeing the cook from the constant bending required by hearthwork. Perhaps you find yourself, at this hour, in some place distant from Hamilton County, a city room, a quiet porch, a long drive through darkness. Yet the past we speak of is not so removed as it might seem. The fields those families tended may now lie beneath pavement or subdivision, but the labor, the hope, the ordinary affection they harbored, these are not alien. We are their inheritors, whether we know their names or not. If this recounting brings you some measure of peace, consider remaining with us through the entries yet to come. There are many counties still to open, many quiet histories waiting to be spoken. Bread formed the foundation of most meals, and baking occupied a significant portion of each week. Flour was mixed with water, salt, and leavening, either yeast cultivated from hops or wild cultures, or later in the century, commercial baking powder. The dough was kneaded, allowed to rise, then shaped into loaves and baked. The smell of fresh bread was one of the defining aromas of the farmhouse, and the ability to produce consistent, palatable loaves was a mark of household competence. Washing was arduous. Water had to be hauled from the well or creek, heated over the fire, and poured into large wooden or metal tubs. Clothes were scrubbed on washboards, wrung by hand, and hung to dry on lines or draped over bushes. In winter, laundry froze stiff on the line, and it was carried indoors to finish drying near the fire. The entire process consumed most of a day, and Monday was traditionally set aside for this purpose. The other days of the week organized around this fixed point. Sewing was both necessity and art. Clothing was made at home from fabric purchased or woven, cut according to patterns passed down or improvised, and stitched by hand or, later, by treadle-powered machines. Mending was constant, as garments were worn hard and expected to last. Quilts, pieced from scraps and backed with worn fabric, provided warmth and represented hours of painstaking work, often undertaken in social settings where women gathered to work collectively. Children were integral to the household economy from an early age. Small children gathered eggs, fed chickens, brought in kindling, and performed other tasks scaled to their abilities. As they grew, their responsibilities expanded. Boys learned the work of the field and barn, accompanying their fathers, and gradually assuming more demanding tasks. Girls worked alongside their mothers, mastering the domestic skills they would need to manage their own households. Education, where it existed, was seasonal and informal. District schools operated primarily in winter, when children could be spared from farm labor. The schoolhouses were simple structures, often a single room heated by a wood stove, with benches and desks of rough construction. Teachers were sometimes itinerant, boarding with families in rotation. The curriculum emphasized reading, writing, and arithmetic, with instruction drawn from whatever books were available, often the Bible, a spelling primer, and perhaps a reader. Social life centered on the church and community gatherings, camp meetings, revival services, and regular Sunday worship provided not only spiritual nourishment, but also opportunities for social connection. News was exchanged, courtships conducted, and alliances formed. The church building itself, often built by communal labor, stood as a physical manifestation of shared faith and mutual obligation. Illness was a constant presence. Without access to modern medicine, families relied on home remedies, herbal preparations, and the knowledge passed down from elders. Childbirth was attended by midwives, often neighbors with long experience. Infant mortality was high, and many families lost children to diseases that are now preventable or easily treated. Graveyards filled with small stones bearing the names of infants and children, silent testimony to the fragility of life. Yet despite these hardships, there existed within the household a structure of affection and mutual dependence. Families worked together, not merely from necessity, but from a sense of shared purpose. The evening meal, taken together after the day's labor, was a moment of communion. The lighting of the lamp as dusk fell, the telling of stories, the quiet conversation before sleep, these small rituals bound families together across the years. Seasonal celebrations punctuated the year. Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the 4th of July were observed with particular attention. Special foods were prepared, families gathered, and the ordinary routine was suspended for a day. These occasions provided markers in the otherwise continuous flow of labor, moments when the household could reflect on its achievements and renew its bonds. While agriculture formed the county's economic foundation, industry and commerce diversified the sources of employment and wealth. Mills, Foundries, tanneries, distilleries, and various manufactories operated throughout the county, their products serving both local needs and distant markets. Milling was among the earliest industries to develop. Grist mills ground farmers' grain into flour and meal, retaining a portion as payment. The mills were social centers, as much as economic enterprises. Farmers, waiting for their grain to be processed, exchanged news and conducted informal business. The miller was a figure of some importance. His skill in setting the stones and maintaining the machinery directly affecting the quality of the product. Sawmills converted the county's timber into lumber for construction. As forests were cleared, the wood was not merely burned or left to rot. It was sawed into boards, beams, and shingles. Sawmilling was seasonal work, concentrated in times when water levels were sufficient to power the machinery. The sound of the saw, a rhythmic, metallic scream, became familiar to those living near these operations. Tanneries processed hides into leather, a commodity essential for shoes, harnesses, belts, and numerous other items. The tanning process was long and malodorous, involving soaking hides in solutions of bark extract and other chemicals. Tanneries were consequently situated away from residential areas when possible, near streams that provided the necessary water and carried away the waste. Families such as the Darrows and the Wolves operated tanneries that supplied leather workers throughout the region. Distilleries converted surplus grain into whiskey, a product that was both consumed locally and shipped downriver. Whiskey was a common beverage, considered safer than water, and valued for its warming properties. The distillation process was relatively simple, requiring a still, a source of heat, and patience. Larger distilleries produced considerable quantities, and the trade in spirits formed a notable part of the county's commerce. Foundries and machine shops appeared as the century progressed, producing iron goods ranging from agricultural implements to architectural elements. The transition from a purely agricultural economy to one that included manufacturing occurred gradually, driven by the availability of raw materials, the presence of skilled craftsmen, and the demand for goods that could not be economically imported. Brickmaking became significant as construction transitioned from wood to masonry. Clay deposits were exploited, and brickyards were established in several townships. The bricks were molded by hand, dried in the sun, and fired in kilns. The product was durable and fire-resistant, qualities highly valued. After several destructive fires in Cincinnati prompted a shift toward fireproof construction. Pottery and stoneware manufacture utilized the same clay resources. Local potters produced utilitarian wares, crocks, jugs, bowls, and pipes that were sold throughout the county. These objects were rarely marked, and attributing specific pieces to individual makers is difficult, yet they represented a significant local craft tradition. Names such as Fenton, Wheatley, and others appeared in directories as pottery operators. Transportation infrastructure evolved to support this diversifying economy. Turnpike companies were chartered to construct improved roads, financed by tolls collected at gates placed at intervals along the route. These turnpikes facilitated trade between Cincinnati and the interior counties, allowing heavier loads to be transported year-round. The roads were surfaced with gravel or, in some cases, planks, and their maintenance was a constant concern. The arrival of railroads transformed the county's commercial geography. Lines were constructed linking Cincinnati to communities in the interior and connecting the city to the broader national network. Stations were built in several townships, and villages that gained a railroad connection often experienced rapid growth, while those bypassed stagnated. The railroad reduced transportation costs and times dramatically, allowing perishable goods to reach distant markets and facilitating passenger travel. Banking and finance became more formalized as the century progressed. Cincinnati hosted numerous banks, and branch institutions appeared in larger villages. Credit relationships, long informal and based on personal reputation, increasingly involved written contracts and standardized terms. Families such as the Longworths, the Kilgores, and the Lyons were prominent in financial circles, their investments shaping the county's development. Commerce extended beyond goods to services. Physicians, though not numerous, established practices in Cincinnati and larger villages, their skills varying widely in an era before standardized medical education. Lawyers handled property transactions, drafted wills, and represented clients in disputes. These professionals formed a small but influential class, their services essential to the functioning of an increasingly complex society. Water shaped Hamilton County's landscape and economy in ways both obvious and subtle. The Ohio River, Mill Creek, the Little Miami River, and numerous smaller streams dictated where settlements arose, where crops thrived, and how commerce flowed. The Ohio, as already noted, was the county's lifeline to the broader world, but its moods required respect. Floods came with some regularity, usually in late winter or early spring, when snow melted upstream and combined with heavy rains. The river could rise 20, 30, even 40 feet above its normal stage, inundating bottomlands and threatening structures built too close to its banks. Families living in flood-prone areas learned to prepare, moving valuables to upper floors and sometimes evacuating entirely. The river also offered bounty. Fish were plentiful: catfish, pike, bass, and others, and fishing supplemented the diet, particularly in seasons when other foods were scarce. Nets, lines, and traps were employed, and certain stretches of the river became known as particularly productive. The Schmidts, the Hofers, and other families who lived along the river often combined farming with fishing, diversifying their subsistence. Mill Creek, flowing southward through the county center, powered dozens of mills over the course of the century. The creek's flow was reliable enough to support industry, yet small enough that individual millers could construct dams and races without excessive capital. The competition for water rights led to disputes and litigation, with downstream operators claiming that upstream dams deprived them of necessary flow. These conflicts were adjudicated in county courts, and the resulting legal precedents shaped property law throughout the region. The Little Miami River, marking the county's eastern boundary, was less commercially significant, but no less important to those who lived along it. The river valley provided fertile land and scenic beauty, qualities that attracted settlers seeking tranquil homesteads. Towns such as Milford grew up along its course, and the river supported both milling and transportation, though on a smaller scale than the Ohio. Smaller streams, Muddy Creek, Duck Creek, and others drained the uplands and provided water for local use. These creeks were often seasonal, flowing strongly in wet months and dwindling to trickles in summer. Nevertheless, they were essential to farms located away from the larger rivers, and their protection from pollution and overuse became a concern as population density increased. Springs, where groundwater emerged from hillsides, were highly valued. A farm with a reliable spring enjoyed a significant advantage, particularly during droughts. Spring water was generally cleaner and colder than creek water, and spring houses, small structures built over springs, were used to keep milk, butter, and other perishables cool. Families such as the Springs, the Brooks, and the Wells often took surnames that reflected the presence of these valued features on their land. Ice harvesting became an industry in itself during the colder decades, when the Ohio or local ponds froze to sufficient thickness. Crews cut blocks of ice, which were stored in insulated ice houses packed with sawdust. The ice was sold throughout the warmer months, used to preserve food in urban markets and to provide comfort in homes and businesses. The work was cold, dangerous, and seasonal, but it provided employment when other opportunities were scarce. Navigation on the Ohio required skill and local knowledge. Sandbars shifted, channels changed, and snags submerged logs posed constant hazards. Pilots learned the river's moods through experience, memorizing landmarks and soundings. Steamboat pilots were respected figures, their knowledge literally invaluable to the safe passage of vessels and cargoes worth thousands of dollars. Bridges were engineering challenges and community achievements. Wooden-covered bridges, which protected the structural timbers from weather, spanned many of the county's waterways. Building a bridge required capital, labor, and cooperation, and their completion was often celebrated with ceremonies and festivities. The bridges bore the names of their builders or the families who financed them: the Schinkel, the Anderson, the Schmidt bridges, and became landmarks in their own right. Ferries operated where bridges were impractical or before they could be built. A ferry was simply a flat-bottomed boat, large enough to carry a wagon and team, pulled across the current by rope or powered by oars. Ferry operators held licenses granted by the county, and the fares they charged were regulated. The ferry crossing was a moment of transition, a liminal space between one shore and another, and travelers often paused to converse with the ferryman, who served as an informal news source. The relationship between the county's inhabitants and its waterways was intimate and complex. Water provided life, power, transportation, and recreation, but it also brought danger, disease, and difficulty. Managing this relationship, building infrastructure, establishing regulations, and adapting to the inevitable changes in flow and course occupied much of the community's collective attention. The functioning of Hamilton County as a political and social entity depended upon institutions that evolved gradually from informal arrangements to established structures. County government, though modest by later standards, provided essential services and adjudicated disputes that private parties could not resolve alone. The county seat, Cincinnati, housed the courthouse, a building of symbolic as well as practical importance. The courthouse served as the venue for trials, the repository of records, and the meeting place for county commissioners. Constructed initially of brick and rebuilt after fire, the courthouse represented the authority of law and the permanence of government. Its construction and maintenance were matters of public concern, debated in newspapers and at public meetings. Courts met on scheduled terms, with judges traveling a circuit that included multiple counties. The arrival of the circuit court brought a heightened sense of formality and occasion. Lawyers assembled, cases were heard, and judgments rendered. The legal system, though sometimes slow and occasionally capricious, provided a mechanism for resolving disputes over property, contracts, and personal injury disputes that might otherwise have escalated into violence. The county commissioners oversaw roads, bridges, and poorhouses, levied taxes, and granted licenses. These men, always men in that era, were elected from districts and served terms of several years. Their decisions affected daily life directly, and they were held accountable at the ballot box. The records of their proceedings, meticulously kept, documented the county's incremental development. Law enforcement was minimal by modern standards. Sheriffs, elected county officials, held primary responsibility for maintaining order and executing court judgments. Constables operated at the township level, handling minor infractions and serving warrants. The absence of professional police forces meant that communities relied heavily on self-regulation and informal social pressure to maintain order. The poorhouse, an institution common to most counties, provided shelter for those without means, the elderly, the disabled, the chronically ill, and those temporarily destitute. The poorhouse was funded by the county and operated under the supervision of a keeper who provided basic food and shelter in exchange for whatever labor the residents could perform. It was a place of last resort, and families went to great lengths to avoid sending members there. Militia companies existed in most townships, organized from the local male population and led by elected officers. These militia units drilled occasionally and served primarily social functions, though they could be mobilized in emergencies. Muster days, when the militia assembled for drill and inspection, were public events marked by speeches, demonstrations, and general festivity. Voluntary associations proliferated as the century progressed. Fraternal orders such as the Masons, Odd Fellows, and later the Knights of Pythias provided mutual aid, social connection, and a sense of belonging. These organizations built lodge halls, conducted initiations and rituals, and organized charitable activities. Membership conferred status and created networks of trust that facilitated business and social relationships. Libraries and reading rooms appeared in Cincinnati and larger villages, supported by subscription or public funds. These institutions reflected a belief in self-improvement and the value of literacy. Collections were modest, but included newspapers, periodicals, histories, novels, and practical manuals. The library served as a quiet refuge, a place where individuals could pursue knowledge beyond the demands of daily labor. Fire companies were organized in Cincinnati and larger villages, initially as volunteer brigades. The fire company served both practical and social purposes, responding to alarms with hand-pumped engines and competing for reputation and prestige. Firemen were respected figures, and the companies often had elaborate uniforms and equipment. Annual parades and competitions showcased their skills and equipment. Cemeteries reflected the community's relationship with death and memory. Early burials occurred in churchyards or on family land, but as populations grew, dedicated cemeteries were established. These landscapes, carefully tended, featured gravestones of varying elaboration, simple markers for the poor, ornate monuments for the wealthy. Families visited regularly, maintaining graves and reinforcing connections across generations. Names such as Spring Grove became synonymous with respectability and permanence. Political participation was vigorous, though limited to white males for most of the century. Elections were public events, with speeches, debates, and considerable consumption of alcohol. Party affiliation Whig, Democrat, later Republican, was a significant part of identity, and families often maintained loyalties across generations. The political process, for all its flaws, provided a mechanism for peaceful transfer of power and community decision-making. The county fair, established mid-century, became an annual highlight. Agricultural products, livestock, and domestic crafts were displayed and judged, and prizes awarded. The fair combined education with entertainment, featuring horse races, speaking contests, and exhibitions of new machinery. For rural families, the fair was an opportunity to compare their achievements with neighbors and to participate in a broader community. Hamilton County, in the latter decades of the century, was a place transformed yet recognizable. The wilderness had given way to cultivated fields, the scattered cabins to substantial farms and towns, yet the rhythms of agricultural life persisted. Change came incrementally, layered upon what had existed before, rather than sweeping away the past entirely. Mechanization altered farming practices. Reapers, threshers, and cultivators reduced the labor required for certain tasks, allowing families to cultivate larger acreages. Yet these machines were expensive, and their adoption was gradual, unevenly distributed across the county. Wealthier farmers purchased machinery first, sometimes hiring out its use to neighbors. The sound of mechanical reapers moving through wheat fields became a new element in the summer soundscape. Railroads continued to expand, their tracks threading through townships and connecting previously isolated communities. The railroad brought not only goods, but also ideas, fashions, and a sense of connection to the wider world. Young people, particularly, felt the pull of distant cities and opportunities, and the county began to experience a slow but steady out-migration as the frontier closed and urban centers offered new forms of employment. Immigration continued to shape the county's demographic character. Germans, Irish, and later arrivals from Eastern and Southern Europe brought diverse traditions, languages, and skills. Neighborhoods in Cincinnati developed distinct ethnic identities, with churches, shops, and social organizations reflecting the residents' origins. These communities maintained connections to the old country while adapting to American circumstances, creating hybrid cultures that enriched the county's social fabric. Education became more systematic. Public schools expanded, school terms lengthened, and teacher training improved. Literacy rates rose, and a high school education, once rare, became an achievable goal for many families. The expansion of education reflected both practical needs. A more complex economy required literate workers and idealistic beliefs about citizenship and self-improvement. Public health measures gradually took hold. Vaccination against smallpox became more common, though resistance persisted in some quarters. Water supplies in Cincinnati and larger towns were improved, with piped systems replacing wells and cisterns. Sewage disposal, long neglected, began to receive attention as the link between sanitation and disease became clearer. These changes occurred slowly, against considerable inertia and expense. Cincinnati's growth continued, the city spreading outward from its original core. Streetcars, first horse-drawn and later electric, facilitated the development of residential neighborhoods at greater distances from workplaces. The wealthy built estates on the hilltops surrounding the basin, enjoying views and fresh air while remaining connected to the city's commercial life. The social geography of the city became more stratified, with clear distinctions between neighborhoods based on class and ethnicity. Churches continued to multiply and diversify. New denominations appeared, and existing congregations split over theological disputes or questions of practice. The church remained a central institution, though its role evolved. Social gospel movements, emphasizing practical charity and social reform, gained adherents. Sunday schools, missionary societies, and temperance organizations operated under church auspices, extending religious influence into secular affairs. The temperance movement, which had existed throughout the century, gained strength in its later decades. Many residents, particularly women, viewed alcohol as a source of domestic violence, poverty, and moral degradation. Temperance societies organized lectures, published literature, and lobbied for restrictive legislation. Saloons, which served as social centers for working-class men, became flashpoints in the debate over alcohol's place in society. Women's roles, while still constrained by legal and social limitations, began to expand. Women's clubs, literary societies, and charitable organizations provided venues for collective action beyond the household. Some women pursued higher education, entering professions such as teaching and nursing. The suffrage movement, advocating for women's voting rights, had adherents in the county, though success remained distant. Agriculture, despite mechanization and improved techniques, remained vulnerable to the vagaries of weather and market. Droughts, floods, and insect infestations periodically devastated crops. Price fluctuations, driven by distant markets and speculative activity, could render a year's labor unprofitable. Farmers, independent in many ways, remained dependent on forces beyond their control. The physical landscape bore the marks of a century's labor. Forests that had covered the land were reduced to scattered woodlots. Wetlands were drained, streams channeled, and hills terraced. The transformation was nearly complete, yet remnants of the earlier landscape persisted: ancient trees that had been spared the axe, springs that still flowed clear, and place names that recalled the vanished wilderness. Memory became a subject of public interest. Historical societies were formed to collect documents, preserve artifacts, and record the reminiscences of the county's oldest residents. The understanding that a distinct era was passing prompted efforts to document it before memory faded entirely. These efforts, though incomplete, created a record that allows later generations to glimpse something of that world. To summarize Hamilton County's experience across the length of that century is to attempt a compression that inevitably distorts the lived reality, the individual days with their particular textures, the specific relationships that shaped each life, the hopes and disappointments that colored existence. These cannot be fully captured in any general account, yet certain patterns emerge, themes that recur across the decades and across the townships. The transformation of the landscape was perhaps the most visible legacy. What had been forest became farmland. What had been wilderness became community. This transformation was neither inevitable nor uncontested. It required immense labor, much of it performed by people whose names are now forgotten. The land itself bore the costs as well as the benefits, with erosion, pollution, and loss of biodiversity accompanying the gains in productivity. The social fabric woven during these years had particular characteristics. Community was both resource and constraint, providing support in times of need, but also enforcing conformity and limiting individual autonomy. The church, the school, the township meeting, these institutions knit people together while also defining boundaries of belonging. Those who fit within the norms prospered socially. Those who did not faced isolation or worse. Economic development brought prosperity to many, but not to all. The transition from subsistence to market agriculture increased productivity, but also introduced volatility. Families who had once been largely self-sufficient found themselves dependent on prices set in distant markets, vulnerable to forces they could neither predict nor control. The rise of industry created new opportunities but also new inequalities, as wealth concentrated among those who owned mills, factories, and transportation networks. The century witnessed profound technological change. The replacement of hand tools by machines, the transition from water power to steam, the arrival of the railroad and telegraph. Each of these innovations altered daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. Yet technology did not determine outcomes. Human choices about how to deploy new capabilities shaped their effects. Some technologies were adopted eagerly, others resisted, and all were adapted to local circumstances. Family remained the fundamental social unit throughout the century. The farm family, working together across generations, represented an ideal, even as reality often fell short. Families were disrupted by death, migration, and conflict, yet the structure persisted. Inheritance practices, marriage patterns, and naming customs all reinforced family continuity and identity. Gender roles, though rigid by later standards, were subject to negotiation within individual households. Women's work, though often undervalued, was essential to household survival and prosperity. The domestic sphere was not simply subordinate to the public, but was itself a site of economic production, cultural transmission, and emotional life. Women exercised considerable authority within their designated domain, and their influence extended beyond it in ways both informal and, occasionally, formal. Childhood was not yet recognized as a distinct life stage requiring special treatment. Children worked alongside adults from an early age, their labor contributing to household economy. Yet affection for children was evident in letters, diaries, and the artifacts preserved from that era. Parents grieved deeply for children lost to disease, and the impulse to educate and improve the prospects of the rising generation motivated much communal effort. The county's relationship with the broader nation evolved across the century. Initially distant from the centers of national power and culture, Hamilton County became increasingly integrated into regional and national networks. The Civil War, which divided the county's loyalties and claimed many lives, marked a turning point, after which the federal government's presence and authority were more keenly felt. Memory and forgetting shaped how the county's history was understood even by those who lived through it. Certain events, floods, fires, notable trials, political contests were remembered and recounted, becoming part of a shared narrative. Other experiences, equally significant to those who lived them, faded from collective memory. The process of historical memory is selective, and what survives is not always what was most important at the time. The landscape itself served as a repository of memory. Old roads, their routes determined by topography and early property lines, remained in use even as they were improved. Cemeteries accumulated generations, their stones marking the passage of families through time. Buildings, particularly those constructed of durable materials like brick and stone, outlasted their original inhabitants and served new purposes. The physical environment thus became a text that later generations could read, though imperfectly. The century's end brought neither triumph nor tragedy, but simply continuation. Life went on, as it always had, with its mixture of joy and sorrow, progress and persistence. The families who inhabited Hamilton County at the close of the century were the inheritors of the work begun by those who arrived 100 years before. They, in turn, would pass the county on to their descendants, altered yet recognizable, shaped by the choices of each generation. And thus, we close the entry for Hamilton County. Rest well.